Welcome to Grave Hush. This is a channel where we share horror bedtime stories to help you relax, fall asleep, and enjoy the calm of the night. If you enjoy our stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new upload. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from and what time it is right now as you're tuning in. Sit back, get comfortable, and let the story begin. This is the story of Amanda Price, a 31-year-old graphic designer who moved into her dream house on Maple Street, only to discover that some neighbors are too quiet for their own good. Amanda had bought the two-story colonial house in January after her promotion allowed her to finally afford a place in a decent neighborhood. The house next door, 47 Maple Street, belonged to the Henderson family, Mark, Carol, and their twin daughters Emma and Sophie, both around 8 years old. During Amanda's first week, she met Carol Henderson while bringing in groceries. Carol was friendly but seemed nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder and speaking in hushed tones. She mentioned that the family kept to themselves and preferred quiet evenings at home. Amanda thought nothing of it until she realized she hadn't heard a single sound from the Henderson house in over 2 weeks. No conversations through the thin walls. No children playing, no television, no footsteps, no running water. Complete silence 24 hours a day, despite the fact that Amanda could see the family's cars in the driveway, and lights turning on every evening at exactly 7:30 p.m. Amanda worked from home, so she was constantly aware of neighborhood sounds. She could hear the Johnson family arguing 3 houses down, the Martinez children playing in their backyard, and traffic from the main road. But from 47 Maple Street, nothing. On March 15th, Amanda decided to investigate. She knocked on the Hendersons' front door at 2 p.m. on a Saturday, knowing the family should be home based on the cars in their driveway. No answer. Amanda could see lights on inside and shadows moving behind the curtains, but no one came to the door. She knocked louder and called out, but received no response. Amanda walked around to the backyard and peered through the kitchen window. She could see Carol Henderson standing at the sink, apparently washing dishes. Amanda tapped on the window and waved, but Carol didn't react at all. Just continued her washing motions without looking up. Amanda tried calling the Henderson house. She could hear the phone ringing inside, but no one answered, even though she could see Carol still standing at the kitchen sink. Over the next week, Amanda conducted a careful observation of her silent neighbors. Every day at 7:30 p.m., lights would turn on throughout the Henderson house in a specific pattern. Kitchen first, then living room, then upstairs bedrooms. At 11 p.m., all lights would turn off simultaneously. During daylight hours, Amanda could occasionally see family members through windows, Mark reading a newspaper in the living room, the twins playing with toys in their bedroom, Carol cooking in the kitchen. But she never saw their mouths move, never saw them interact with each other, and never heard any sounds from their activities. Amanda began timing the family's visible activities and discovered something disturbing. Every day, Hendersons followed identical routines down to the minute. Mark would sit in his chair at 9 a.m. and read until 10:15 a.m. Carol would cook lunch at 12:30 p.m. and finish at 1 p.m. The twins would play in their room from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. The routines never varied, never changed, like clockwork. Amanda called the local police non-emergency line to request a wellness check. Officer Patricia Santos arrived within an hour and knocked on the Henderson door while Amanda watched from her window. No response. Officer Santos peered through windows and confirmed that she could see family members inside the house, but they weren't responding to her presence or her knocking. Officer Santos called for backup and entered the house using emergency authority protocols. 20 minutes later, Officer Santos emerged from the Henderson house looking pale and shaken. She immediately called for the coroner and crime scene investigation unit. Amanda was questioned about her observations, and Officer Santos revealed something that made Amanda's blood run cold. The Henderson family was dead. All 4 family members had been deceased for approximately 6 months, based on the state of decomposition. They had died from carbon monoxide poisoning due to a faulty heating system. but Amanda had been seeing them moving around the house for 3 months. Detective Raymond Clark took over the investigation and reviewed utility records for 47 Maple Street. The gas, water, and electricity had all been shut off for non-payment in September 6 months earlier, shortly after the family's death, yet Amanda had been seeing lights turn on every night at 7:30 p.m. Detective Clark interviewed other neighbors and discovered that no one else had seen the Henderson family or noticed any lights in their house for months. Amanda was the only person who had observed any activity at 47 Maple Street. The coroner's examination revealed that the Henderson family had died on August 23rd, but their bodies weren't discovered until March 22nd, the day Amanda reported her concerns. They had been sitting in their respective locations throughout the house, decomposed but positioned as if going about their daily routines. Mark was in his living room chair with a 6-month-old newspaper. Carol was standing at the kitchen sink with her hands in a basin of long evaporated water. The twins were in their bedroom, sitting with toys arranged around them. Amanda realized she had been watching the ghost routines of a family who had died maintaining their normal daily schedule, trapped in an endless loop of domestic activities. But the most disturbing discovery came when Detective Clark reviewed Amanda's phone records. Amanda had made dozens of calls to the Henderson house number over the past 3 months, but the Henderson phone service had been disconnected in August. The phone company had no record of Amanda's calls going through to any number. Amanda had been calling a disconnected phone line and somehow hearing it ring in a house with no electrical service. Detective Clark also found something in Amanda's house that she hadn't noticed. In her basement, there was a carbon monoxide leak from her own heating system, the same type of malfunction that had killed the Henderson family. Amanda had been slowly poisoning herself with carbon monoxide for months, causing hallucinations and making her see the ghostly routines of neighbors who had died from identical circumstances. Amanda was hospitalized for carbon monoxide poisoning and recovered after 2 weeks of treatment. Her heating system was repaired and she returned to her house on Maple Street. But Amanda told me that sometimes late at night she still sees lights turning on at 47 Maple Street at exactly 7:30 p.m. When she looks closely, she can see the Henderson family going through their eternal routines, maintaining their quiet household schedule even in death. The difference now is that Amanda knows she's seeing ghosts, and she checks her carbon monoxide detectors every single day to make sure she's not slowly joining their silent neighborhood. Because some families are so committed to their peaceful home life that not even death can make them break their routine. I got this story in my Instagram DMs last week from someone who claimed they couldn't sleep anymore because of what they discovered about their neighbor. After reading their account, I understand why they needed to share this with someone. This happened to Ethan Rodriguez, a 27-year-old software engineer who moved into a quiet apartment building in Denver last spring. Ethan worked remotely, so he spent most of his time at home in his second-floor unit, which faced directly across a narrow courtyard to another building. From his living room window, Ethan had a clear view into the apartment across from him, where an elderly woman named Mrs. Dorothy Klein lived alone. Ethan had met her briefly in the building's mailroom. She was polite but seemed frail and rarely spoke above a whisper. What immediately struck Ethan about Mrs. Klein was her routine. Every morning when he opened his curtains at 7 a.m., she was already standing at her window looking directly at his apartment. When he went to bed at 11 p.m., she was still there in the exact same position. At first, Ethan assumed Mrs. Klein just enjoyed watching the courtyard activity. Elderly people often spent time looking out windows to feel connected to the world outside their apartments. But after 2 weeks, Ethan realized something disturbing. Mrs. Klein never moved from the window. Not once in 14 days had he seen her step away, sit down, or even shift her position. She stood perfectly still, arms at her sides, staring directly across at Ethan's apartment. Ethan began timing her presence. 7 a.m., there. 10 a.m., still there. 2 p.m., same position. 8 p.m., hadn't moved. 11 p.m., exactly where she'd been 16 hours earlier. Mrs. Klein never ate meals at the window, never read a book, never watched television. She just stood motionless, staring with an intensity that made Ethan increasingly uncomfortable. Ethan tried waving at Mrs. Klein to acknowledge her presence, but she never waved back or showed any sign of recognition. Her expression remained blank, her eyes fixed on his apartment with unblinking focus. After a month of this constant surveillance, Ethan decided to document Mrs. Klein's behavior. He set up a time-lapse camera pointed at her window and recorded her for 24 hours straight. When Ethan reviewed the footage, he discovered something that made his hands shake. Mrs. Klein didn't move for the entire 24-hour period, not a single muscle twitch, not a blink, not even the natural swaying that occurs when people stand still for extended periods. Mrs. Klein stood like a statue for 24 consecutive hours. Ethan was concerned about her health and decided to check on her. He knocked on her apartment door, but there was no answer. He could see light under the door and hear what sounded like a television playing softly inside. But Mrs. Klein didn't respond to his knocking. Ethan contacted the building manager, Susan Walsh, and explained his concerns about Mrs. Klein's unusual behavior. Susan had worked at the building for 8 years and knew all the residents well. "Mrs. Klein is a lovely woman," Susan said, "very quiet, always pays her rent on time. But now that you mention it, I haven't actually seen her outside her apartment in several months." Susan used her master key to enter Mrs. Klein's apartment for a wellness check. Ethan waited in the hallway, expecting to hear conversation or an explanation for Mrs. Klein's window watching. Instead, he heard Susan scream. Susan ran out of the apartment, pale and trembling, immediately calling 911. Within 20 minutes, police and paramedics arrived to investigate Mrs. Klein's unit. Detective Michael Chung emerged from the apartment and questioned Ethan about his observations. "Mr. Rodriguez, you said you've been seeing Mrs. Klein at her window every day for the past month." "Yes, every day. She never moves from that spot." Detective Chang looked confused. "Sir, Mrs. Klein has been dead for approximately 6 weeks. Natural causes, looks like a heart attack while she was standing at her window." Ethan was shocked. "That's impossible. I saw her this morning. She's been there every day." Detective Chang took Ethan into Mrs. Klein's apartment to see for himself. Mrs. Klein's body was still positioned at the window, mummified by the dry apartment air and the building's heating system. She had died while looking out at Ethan's apartment and had remained standing due to rigor mortis and the support of the window frame. But here's what made Detective Chang call for additional investigation. Mrs. Klein's apartment had been sealed from the inside with no signs of forced entry. Yet someone had been paying her rent, buying her groceries, and maintaining her utilities for 6 weeks after her death. Detective Chang found fresh food in Mrs. Klein's refrigerator, recently delivered mail sorted on her kitchen table, and utility bills that had been paid just 3 days earlier. Someone had been taking care of Mrs. Klein's affairs while her body decomposed at the window. The investigation revealed that Mrs. Klein's nephew, David Klein, had been using his spare key to maintain her apartment, knowing she was dead but not reporting her death because he needed her Social Security checks to pay his gambling debts. David had been entering the apartment weekly to collect Mrs. Klein's mail, pay her bills with her Social Security money, and maintain the appearance that she was still alive. But David swore he never moved or disturbed his aunt's body. He claimed he was too afraid to go near the window where she had died. Detective Chang reviewed security footage from the building's entrance and discovered something that explained Ethan's sightings. The footage showed David entering Mrs. Klein's apartment every Tuesday evening and leaving Wednesday morning, but it also showed someone else. The cameras captured a figure that looked exactly like Mrs. Klein leaving her apartment at various times and returning hours later. But the timestamps showed these sightings occurred after her confirmed death date. Ethan realized he had been watching Mrs. Klein's ghost maintaining her window vigil, while her nephew unknowingly preserved the scene of her death for weeks. The most chilling discovery came when Detective Chang examined Mrs. Klein's apartment more closely. On the windowsill where she had died, there were dozens of photographs of Ethan going about his daily activities in his apartment. Pictures taken with a telephoto lens over several months before her death. Mrs. Klein had been obsessively documenting Ethan's life, and her death hadn't ended her surveillance. Ethan moved out of the building immediately, but he told me that no matter where he lives now, he sometimes sees Mrs. Klein standing at windows of nearby buildings, still watching him with that same unblinking stare. Because some people become so fixated on watching others that death can't break their focus, and they continue their surveillance from whatever window gives them the best view of their target. My brother called me at 3:47 a.m. last Tuesday, his voice shaking so badly I could barely understand what he was saying. What he told me about his neighbors will make you question everything you think you know about the people living next door to you. This is about my brother Tyler Morgan, a 34-year-old paramedic who bought his first house in a quiet suburb of Phoenix 6 months ago. Tyler worked long shifts at the hospital, so he appreciated having a peaceful neighborhood where he could rest between his demanding 12-hour emergency calls. The house next door was owned by the Blackwood family, Gregory, his wife Helen, and their teenage son Marcus. They seemed like normal people when Tyler first met them. Gregory worked in accounting, Helen was a librarian, and Marcus was a quiet high school student who kept to himself. Tyler's first indication that something was wrong came 3 weeks after moving in. Every night at exactly 2:30 a.m. he would hear what sounded like multiple people chanting in a language he didn't recognize. The sounds came from the Blackwood house, specifically from what appeared to be their basement. The chanting would last exactly 47 minutes and always ended at 3:17 a.m. with a sound that Tyler described as like someone screaming underwater. Tyler initially assumed the Blackwoods were practicing some kind of meditation or cultural ceremony. Phoenix had a diverse population, and Tyler didn't want to be the nosy neighbor who complained about unfamiliar religious practices. But after 2 weeks of sleepless nights, Tyler decided to investigate. He positioned himself at his bedroom window, which had a partial view of the Blackwood backyard, and waited for the 2:30 a.m. chanting to begin. What Tyler saw in their yard made his blood freeze. The Blackwoods had arranged a circle of black candles around what appeared to be a symbol carved into their lawn, a pentagram with additional markings Tyler had never seen before. Gregory, Helen, and Marcus were standing at 3 points of the pentagram, wearing dark robes and holding what looked like ancient books. But they weren't alone in the circle. Tyler could see additional figures moving within the pentagram. Tall, shadowy forms that didn't look entirely human. These figures had elongated limbs, moved in ways that defied normal anatomy, and seemed to flicker in and out of visibility. Tyler tried to record what he was seeing with his phone, but every time he pointed the camera at the Blackwood yard, the device would malfunction, showing only static or shutting down completely. The chanting grew louder, and Tyler could hear individual words that made his skin crawl. The language sounded ancient and harsh, with syllables that seemed to hurt his ears when he tried to focus on them. As the ritual reached its climax around 3:15 a.m., Tyler witnessed something that made him question his sanity. One of the shadow figures stepped out of the pentagram and walked directly toward Tyler's house. The entity moved through the fence between their properties like it was made of air, crossed Tyler's backyard, and stood directly beneath his bedroom window looking up at him. Tyler found himself unable to move or look away from the creature's face, which appeared to be constantly shifting between different expressions of rage, hunger, and ancient intelligence. The entity spoke in a voice that Tyler heard inside his head rather than through his ears. The Blackwoods have been faithful servants. Soon we will need more neighbors to join our eternal congregation. Tyler blacked out and woke up the next morning with no memory of how he'd gotten from the window to his bed. Tyler tried to convince himself it had been a nightmare caused by stress from his new job and new house. But that evening he found something on his front porch that proved the experience had been real. A handwritten invitation on expensive paper that read, "Tyler Morgan, you are cordially invited to join the Blackwood family for our evening devotions. Your participation would be greatly appreciated by our congregation and our honored guests from the lower realm." The invitation was signed by all 3 Blackwoods and included a postscript. Attendance is not optional for long-term residents of this neighborhood. Tyler researched the history of his street and discovered something that explained everything. Between 1987 and 2019, 8 families had lived in Tyler's house. Every single family had moved away within 1 year, all citing neighborhood disturbances and incompatible neighbors. Tyler found online reviews and forum posts from previous residents describing identical experiences, nightly chanting, supernatural entities, and eventually receiving invitations to join the Blackwood rituals. But Tyler also found something more disturbing. 3 families who had lived in his house had simply vanished without forwarding addresses. The Carson family in 2003, the Williams family in 2011, and the Rodriguez family in 2018 had all disappeared after living next to the Blackwoods for exactly 11 months. Tyler realized he had been in his house for 6 months and 2 weeks. Tyler decided to confront the Blackwoods directly. The next evening, he knocked on their door at 8 p.m. before their ritual time. Gregory Blackwood answered, looking exactly like the mild-mannered accountant Tyler had first met. "Tyler, how nice to see you. We've been hoping you'd visit." "I know about your rituals," Tyler said. "I know about the things you're summoning in your backyard." Gregory smiled, but his eyes turned completely black. "Of course you do. We've been preparing a space for you in our circle. Our patrons are very excited to meet you personally." Helen appeared behind Gregory, also with black eyes. "We've been so patient, Tyler. But patience has limits. Tonight would be an excellent night for you to join us." Tyler backed away from the door, but found Marcus Blackwood standing behind him in the yard. The teenager's eyes were also black, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like multiple people talking in unison. "The circle requires 4 human anchors for the greater summoning," Marcus explained. "We've been a family of 3 for too long. Our patrons demand completion." Tyler ran back to his house and immediately called a real estate agent. He put his house on the market that night and moved into a hotel until he could find a new place to live. But Tyler's escape wasn't as clean as he hoped. The real estate agent called him 3 days later with disturbing news. Every potential buyer who toured Tyler's house had withdrawn their offers after meeting the Blackwood family. The Blackwoods were telling prospective buyers that Tyler was still part of the neighborhood and would be returning very soon to complete his obligations. Tyler moved to a different state, but he told me that sometimes late at night he receives text messages from unknown numbers containing photos of pentagrams carved into lawns and invitations to neighborhood gatherings. Because some neighbors don't just want to borrow a cup of sugar, they want to borrow your soul for their demonic patrons, and they're willing to wait as long as necessary to collect what they believe you owe them. Last month, my cousin Sarah called me in tears asking if she could stay at my place indefinitely. When I asked what happened, she told me a story about her neighbor's children that still gives me nightmares every time I think about it. This is about Sarah Martinez, a 29-year-old elementary school teacher who rented a duplex in suburban Cleveland. Sarah loved working with children and thought living in a family-friendly neighborhood would be perfect for someone in her profession. The other half of the duplex was occupied by the Thorne family, David, his wife Rebecca, and their 3 children. Twins Alex and Emma, age 7, and their younger brother Noah, age 5. The Thornes seemed like an ideal family when Sarah first met them, and she was excited to have children living so close by. Sarah's first concern arose during her second week in the duplex. She could hear the Thorne children playing in their backyard, but their games sounded unusually violent and disturbing. Through the thin walls, Sarah heard Alex shouting, "I'm going to rip your head off and drink your blood," followed by Emma laughing and saying, "Let's bury the pieces in the garden so they can grow into more victims." Sarah assumed this was typical childhood imagination influenced by horror movies or video games. Kids often played elaborate fantasy games that sounded scary to adults. But the children's play escalated quickly into scenarios that made Sarah genuinely uncomfortable. She heard them discussing in detail how to harvest human organs, torture prisoners in the basement, and summon the shadow people to help with kidnapping. These weren't normal childhood games. The conversations were too sophisticated, too detailed, and too focused on genuine violence and cruelty. Sarah decided to observe the children more closely when they played outside. What she saw in their backyard made her question everything she thought she knew about child development. The Thorne children were playing with what appeared to be dead animals, cats, squirrels, and birds, arranging them in geometric patterns while chanting words Sarah had never heard before. The animals looked freshly killed, and the children handled them with a casual familiarity that suggested this wasn't their first time. 7-year-old Alex would hold up a dead cat and speak to it like it was responding, carrying on full conversations with the corpse. Emma would arrange bird bones and complex symbols while little Noah danced around the patterns singing in what sounded like Latin. Sarah tried to rationalize what she was seeing. Maybe the children had found roadkill and were conducting innocent funeral ceremonies. Many kids were fascinated by death and tried to process it through play. But Sarah's rationalization crumbled when she witnessed something that defied explanation. While watching from her kitchen window, Sarah saw Emma pick up a dead squirrel and hold it against her chest. The squirrel's eyes opened, its body twitched, and it began moving again. Emma had somehow brought the animal back to life through touch. The resurrected squirrel didn't behave normally. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, and its eyes glowed with an eerie light. Emma commanded the animal to perform tricks, and it obeyed with robotic precision. Sarah was horrified, but she was also a mandatory reporter as a teacher. If these children were being abused or exposed to harmful influences, she had a legal obligation to investigate. Sarah called Child Protective Services and reported her concerns about the Thorne children's behavior and their apparent involvement with dead animals. CPS worker Janet Coleman arrived the next day to conduct a home visit with the Thorne family. Sarah watched from her window as Janet knocked on the door and was greeted by what appeared to be a perfectly normal, well-adjusted family. David and Rebecca Thorne were polite and cooperative. The children were clean, articulate, and displayed none of the disturbing behavior Sarah had witnessed. They showed Janet their toys, talked about school, and demonstrated the kind of innocent childhood interests that would impress any social worker. Janet found no evidence of abuse, neglect, or inappropriate influences. The Thorne home was clean and well-maintained. The children appeared healthy and happy, and the parents seemed genuinely caring and responsible. But after Janet left, Sarah heard Alex's voice through the wall. "She didn't see anything because we didn't want her to see anything. We're good at hiding what we really are." Emma responded, "The lady next door is causing problems. Maybe it's time to show her what happens to people who try to interfere with our family." That night, Sarah woke up to find all 3 Thorne children standing silently in her bedroom. She had locked her doors and windows, but somehow the children had entered her half of the duplex without making any sound. The children stared at Sarah with expressions that looked far too mature for their ages. Alex spoke in a voice that sounded deeper and older than his 7-year-old vocal cords should allow. "Miss Martinez, we know you've been watching us. We know you called the authorities. We don't like people who cause trouble for our family." Emma stepped closer to Sarah's bed. "We could hurt you very badly if we wanted to. We could make you disappear like we did to the man who lived here before you." Little Noah giggled and added, "Or we could make you join our games in the backyard. Forever and ever and ever." Sarah was paralyzed with fear, but she managed to ask, "What do you want from me?" Alex smiled with too many teeth. "We want you to mind your own business. Stop watching us, stop calling people about us, and stop trying to interfere with our family. Do that, and we'll let you keep living here." The children turned and walked out of Sarah's bedroom, disappearing as silently as they had arrived. Sarah packed her belongings that same night and moved out before sunrise. She broke her lease and forfeited her security deposit rather than spend another day in that duplex. But before leaving, Sarah researched the previous tenant Alex had mentioned. She found a missing person report for Michael Chen, a graduate student who had rented Sarah's half of the duplex the year before. Michael had vanished without a trace after living there for only 6 weeks. Police found no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, and no indication of where Michael might have gone. His car, belongings, and identification were all left behind in the duplex. Sarah realized that the Thorne children weren't supernatural demons or possessed by evil spirits. They were something far more terrifying, genuinely psychopathic children with advanced manipulation skills and no empathy or conscience. The dead animals, the violent games, the ability to appear normal to authority figures. These were all signs of severe antisocial personality disorders manifesting at an unusually young age. Sarah reported her experiences to local police, but without physical evidence or witness testimony, there was little they could investigate. The Thorne family appeared normal to everyone except their immediate neighbors, who tended to move away quickly. Sarah now works as a teacher in a different state, but she told me she still has nightmares about those children and wonders how many other neighbors have discovered what the Thorne kids are really capable of when no adults are watching. Because sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't supernatural creatures. They're human children who haven't developed the basic empathy that prevents most people from becoming predators. Jessica lived in 2B on the 2nd floor. The unit directly below her, 1B, was occupied by the Carver family, Michael, his wife Patricia, and their 12-year-old daughter Lily. Jessica first noticed something unusual about the Carvers during her 3rd week in the building. Every night between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. she could hear what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor, followed by loud shouting and what appeared to be multiple people arguing in the apartment below. The arguments weren't typical family disputes. Jessica could hear Michael and Patricia screaming phrases like, "Leave her alone," and "Get out of our house," followed by responses in voices that didn't sound like any member of the Carver family. Jessica assumed the family was having serious domestic problems and considered reporting it to building management or social services if the situation escalated. But on her 4th week, Jessica heard something that made her realize this wasn't a normal family crisis. At 2:47 a.m., Jessica was woken by the sound of Lily Carver screaming in a voice that was definitely not her own. The scream was deep, guttural, and spoke in what sounded like multiple languages simultaneously. "You cannot save her. She belongs to us now. We have been waiting so long for a pure vessel." This was followed by Michael Carver's voice shouting, "Father Murphy, keep reading. Don't stop the prayer no matter what you hear." Jessica realized the Carvers had brought a priest into their apartment and were conducting some kind of exorcism on their daughter. Jessica pressed her ear to the floor and could hear Latin chanting, religious prayers being recited rapidly, and Lily's voice switching between her normal 12-year-old tone and something that sounded ancient and malevolent. "Please, Daddy, make it stop. They're hurting me," followed immediately by "Your daughter is gone. We are legion. We are eternal." The exorcism sessions continued every night for 2 weeks. Jessica could track the progression of whatever was happening to Lily Carver through the sounds that came through her floor. Some nights, the religious ceremonies seemed successful. Jessica would hear Lily speaking normally, the family praying together peacefully, and what sounded like celebration. But other nights, the demonic voices were stronger, more violent, and Jessica could hear furniture being thrown, glass breaking, and Patricia Carver crying, while Michael begged unseen entities to leave his daughter alone. Jessica began documenting the nightly activities, noting the times, duration, and intensity of each exorcism session. She discovered a disturbing pattern. The demonic episodes were getting longer and more violent, while the periods of Lily's normal behavior were becoming shorter and weaker. After 3 weeks of nightly exorcisms, Jessica decided to investigate more directly. She positioned herself in the building's hallway during one of the Carver family's religious ceremonies and listened outside their door. What she heard made her blood run cold. There were definitely multiple priests in the apartment, at least 3 different male voices reciting prayers and performing rituals. But there were also sounds that Jessica couldn't identify. Scratching, hissing, and what sounded like heavy objects being thrown by invisible forces. Through the door, Jessica could hear Lily's voice pleading, "Jessica from upstairs. I know you're listening. Please help me. They're trying to take over my body and they won't leave." Jessica was shocked that Lily knew she was outside the door, but before she could respond, Lily's voice changed completely. "Jessica Blake, apartment 2B, nurse at Salem General Hospital. We know everything about you. Soon you will join our collection." Jessica ran back to her apartment, terrified that whatever was affecting Lily Carver now knew personal details about her life. The next morning, Jessica encountered Michael Carver in the building's mailroom. He looked exhausted, his hair was disheveled, and his hands were covered in what appeared to be scratches and burns. "Mr. Carver, are you all right? I've been hearing some concerning sounds from your apartment." Michael looked at Jessica with desperate eyes. "You need to move out of this building immediately. What's happening to our family is spreading. It started with Lily, but now it's affecting Patricia and me. Soon it will reach the other apartments." Michael explained that Lily had been possessed by multiple demonic entities for over 2 months. They had tried everything, different priests, different religions, medical evaluation, psychiatric treatment, but nothing was working. "The demons told us they chose this building specifically because of its history," Michael said. "This house was built on land where accused witches were executed in 1692. The entities have been waiting centuries for the right family to inhabit this space." Michael revealed something that made Jessica's situation much more dangerous than she had realized. The demons weren't just possessing Lily. They were using her as a gateway to bring more entities into the physical world, and the building itself was becoming a supernatural conduit. "They're planning to possess every resident in this building," Michael warned. "Lily told us while she was still conscious that the demons need 4 human hosts to complete their manifestation. We're not just fighting for our daughter. We're fighting to prevent something much worse from being unleashed on this entire neighborhood." Jessica asked why the Carvers hadn't moved out or contacted authorities for help. Michael showed Jessica recent photographs of his family. In every image, there were additional figures visible. Shadowy forms standing behind the Carvers, touching their shoulders, whispering in their ears. The demons were already partially attached to Michael and Patricia, preventing them from leaving the building or seeking outside help. "We tried to move out last month," Michael explained, "but every time we get more than 2 blocks away from this building, we start experiencing excruciating pain, hallucinations, and blackouts. The entities won't let us leave because they need us here to complete their ritual." Jessica realized she was trapped in a building with a family that was being systematically possessed by demons who intended to use all 4 apartments as gateways for a larger supernatural invasion. That night, Jessica heard the most violent exorcism session yet. But this time, the demonic voices were coming from both Lily and Patricia Carver simultaneously. The possession was spreading exactly as Michael had warned. Jessica made a decision that saved her life. Instead of staying to help the Carver family, she packed essential belongings and left the building immediately, forfeiting her lease and security deposit. Jessica called the Salem Police Department and reported the situation as a potential child abuse case, giving them the building address and requesting immediate intervention. 3 days later, Jessica learned the outcome of the police investigation. Officers had found the Carver apartment empty with no signs of the family or their belongings. The apartment showed evidence of severe damage, burn marks on walls, scratches carved into floors, and what appeared to be symbols etched into every surface. The property management company had no forwarding address for the Carver family, and their previous references and employment records had been fabricated. According to the investigation, no family named Carver had ever officially rented apartment 1B. Jessica discovered that she had been living above people who didn't legally exist, experiencing supernatural events that left no official evidence, in a building with a documented history of unexplained tenant disappearances dating back to its conversion in 1987. Jessica now lives in a different state and works at a hospital where she specializes in psychiatric emergency cases. She told me that her experience with the Carver family taught her that sometimes the most terrifying situations are the ones where you can't get help, because no one will believe what you've witnessed. But Jessica also learned something more important. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not stay to help people who are in danger, but recognize when you're in over your head and get yourself to safety before you become part of the problem you're trying to solve. Because some neighbors' problems are bigger than anything you can handle, and trying to help them might result in you becoming another victim of whatever they're fighting against. Something strange has been happening on Oakwood Avenue for the past 8 months, and I'm the only one who seems to notice. What I've discovered about my neighbor's house will make you pay attention to who comes and goes from the houses around you. This is about Kevin Walsh, a 32-year-old freelance graphic designer who works from home and has a clear view of his neighbor's activities from his home office window. Kevin lives at 1247 Oakwood Avenue, and the house next door at 1249 belongs to Harold Brennan, a retired 68-year-old man who lives alone. Kevin had always been observant about his neighborhood. It came with working from home and taking frequent breaks to look outside. He noticed patterns in people's routines, delivery schedules, and visitor habits without really meaning to. Harold Brennan seemed like a popular man. Every week, Kevin would see different people visiting Harold's house: delivery drivers, maintenance workers, family members, friends, and what appeared to be healthcare providers or social workers. What caught Kevin's attention was the frequency of these visits. Harold received visitors almost daily, sometimes multiple people in a single day. For a retired man living alone, this seemed unusually social. Kevin began casually tracking the visitors out of curiosity. Monday, a young woman in nursing scrubs. Tuesday, an elderly man with a briefcase. Wednesday, a middle-aged couple carrying flowers. Thursday, a delivery driver with multiple packages. The visitors all stayed for reasonable amounts of time, anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. Nothing seemed suspicious about their arrival patterns or behavior. But after 6 weeks of observation, Kevin realized something that made him uncomfortable. He had never seen any of these visitors leave Harold's house. Kevin thought he might be missing their departures due to his work schedule or bathroom breaks, so he started paying more deliberate attention. He would note when someone arrived at Harold's house, then check periodically to see when they left. But the departures never happened. A healthcare worker would arrive at 10 a.m., and Kevin would check Harold's driveway every hour until 6 p.m. The visitor's car would still be there. The next morning, the car would be gone, but Kevin never saw it leave. Kevin started timing his breaks to coincide with visitor arrivals. He would watch people walk up to Harold's door, get invited inside, and then nothing. Hours would pass with no sign of anyone leaving the house. After 2 months of this pattern, Kevin decided to conduct a more systematic observation. He set up a simple camera pointed at Harold's driveway and front door, recording whenever motion was detected. The results disturbed Kevin deeply. The camera recorded visitors arriving at Harold's house throughout the week: postal workers, food delivery drivers, what appeared to be family members, and various service providers. But the camera never recorded anyone leaving. Kevin reviewed hours of footage, fast-forwarding through entire days. People would walk up to Harold's door and enter the house, but there was no corresponding footage of them exiting. Kevin counted 17 different people who had entered Harold's house over a 2-week period, but 0 people leaving. Kevin tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe Harold had a back door that visitors used to leave. Maybe the camera's motion detection was missing their departures. Maybe Kevin's sleep schedule was causing him to miss obvious explanations. But Kevin's concern escalated when he recognized one of Harold's visitors, Maria Santos, a home health care aide who worked for several elderly residents in the neighborhood. Kevin knew Maria because she had provided care for his grandmother the previous year. Maria was reliable, professional, and always maintained strict schedules with her clients. Kevin watched Maria arrive at Harold's house on Tuesday at 9 a.m. for what should have been a routine 2-hour visit. Kevin checked throughout the day. Maria's car remained in Harold's driveway until Kevin went to sleep at midnight. The next morning, Maria's car was gone, but Kevin had not seen her leave. Kevin called the healthcare agency where Maria worked and asked to speak with her about his grandmother's old medical equipment. "I'm sorry, Mr. Walsh," the receptionist said. "Maria Santos hasn't reported for work in 3 days. We've been trying to reach her, but her phone goes straight to voicemail. Her family filed a missing person report yesterday." Kevin was shocked. Maria had disappeared after entering Harold's house, and now she was officially missing. Kevin decided to investigate more directly. He walked over to Harold's house and knocked on the front door, planning to ask casual questions about recent visitors. Harold answered the door looking completely normal, friendly, alert, and welcoming. "Kevin, how nice to see you. What can I do for you? I was wondering if you'd seen Maria Santos recently. She used to help my grandmother, and her family is looking for her." Harold looked confused. "Maria Santos? I don't think I know anyone by that name. Are you sure you have the right house?" Kevin was certain Harold was lying. He had watched Maria enter this house 3 days earlier. "I could have sworn I saw her visiting you this week," Kevin pressed. Harold's expression didn't change, but Kevin noticed something unsettling in his eyes, a flicker of what looked like amusement. "I'm sorry, Kevin, but you must be mistaken. I haven't had any visitors lately. I keep to myself mostly." Kevin knew this was a lie. He had recorded dozens of people entering Harold's house over the past 3 months. Kevin contacted the police and reported his concerns about Maria's disappearance in Harold's house. Detective Jennifer Park took his statement and reviewed Kevin's camera footage. "Mr. Walsh, this footage shows people approaching your neighbor's house, but I don't see anyone actually entering. Are you sure these people went inside?" Kevin was confused. He watched the footage with Detective Park, and she was right. The camera showed visitors walking up to Harold's door, but there was no clear footage of them actually entering the house. But Kevin was certain he had seen people go inside. He had watched it happen dozens of times. Detective Park conducted a welfare check on Harold Brennan and searched his property. Harold was cooperative and allowed complete access to his house. The search revealed nothing suspicious. Harold's house was clean, well-maintained, and showed no signs of multiple visitors or any evidence of foul play. But Detective Park made a discovery that explained everything and horrified Kevin. Harold Brennan had been suffering from severe dementia for over 2 years. According to his medical records, Harold often experienced detailed hallucinations and believed he was receiving visitors who didn't exist. Kevin realized that Harold wasn't hiding visitors in his house. Harold was having conversations with imaginary people, and Kevin had been interpreting Harold's dementia episodes as evidence of real visitors. The people Kevin thought he saw entering Harold's house were a combination of Kevin's own pattern-seeking behavior, camera angles that obscured the full picture, and his misinterpretation of Harold's solitary activities. Maria Santos was found safe 3 days later. She had been visiting her sister in another state and had forgotten to notify her employer about taking personal time. Kevin learned that sometimes the most mysterious neighbor activities have simple, sad explanations. Harold wasn't a sinister figure hiding visitors. He was a lonely elderly man whose mind was creating the social connections he desperately missed. Kevin now checks on Harold regularly and has helped connect him with legitimate social services and healthcare support. Because sometimes the scary neighbor mystery is actually a neighbor in need of help, and the real horror is how isolation and illness can make someone's life appear threatening when they're actually just struggling to maintain connections with a world that's becoming harder for them to understand. This happened to Caleb Morrison, a 35-year-old security technician who installed alarm systems throughout residential neighborhoods. Caleb thought he'd seen everything unusual about people's homes until he encountered the Ashford family on Pine Ridge Drive. The Ashfords had recently moved into the expensive colonial house at 2847 Pine Ridge, Richard, his wife Victoria, and their teenage daughter Sophia. They were the kind of neighbors everyone wanted. Attractive, polite, well-dressed, and always willing to help with community activities. Caleb first met them when Richard hired him to install a comprehensive security system throughout their new home. The job required 3 days of work, giving Caleb plenty of opportunity to observe the family's daily routines. On his first day, Caleb noticed something odd while installing cameras in the living room. The Ashfords had no family photographs anywhere in the house. No wedding pictures, no childhood photos of Sophia, no images of extended family or friends. For a family that seemed so perfect and established, the complete absence of personal photographs was unusual. When Caleb mentioned this to Victoria, she laughed and said they were very private people who preferred not to display personal images where visitors could see them. On his second day, Caleb was working in the kitchen when he observed the family's lunch routine. Richard, Victoria, and Sophia sat at the dining table with elaborate meals, but Caleb never actually saw any of them eating. They would cut food, move it around their plates, and engage in conversation, but the food never seemed to reach their mouths. Caleb thought maybe they were waiting for him to finish his work before eating privately, but when he returned from lunch break, their plates were still full of untouched food. The third day brought Caleb's most disturbing observation. While installing the final security panel in the upstairs hallway, Caleb heard the family having a conversation in the master bedroom. But the voices didn't sound right. Richard was speaking in what sounded like Victoria's voice. Victoria was using Sophia's voice, and Sophia was speaking in Richard's deep tone. They were having a normal family discussion about grocery shopping and weekend plans, but their voices were completely mismatched to their bodies. Caleb pressed his ear to the bedroom door and listened carefully. The voice swapping continued for about 10 minutes before returning to normal. When the family emerged from the bedroom, everyone was speaking in their correct voices again. Caleb convinced himself he had misheard the conversation through the door, but something about the Ashford family continued to bother him. A week after completing the installation, Caleb received a service call to the Ashford house. Their security system was malfunctioning, displaying error codes that Caleb had never seen before in 15 years of alarm system work. When Caleb arrived to diagnose the problem, he discovered that every motion sensor in the house was triggering simultaneously, but the cameras weren't detecting any movement. The system was recording hours of footage showing empty rooms while motion detectors indicated constant activity. Richard explained that they had been experiencing technical difficulties since moving in, but couldn't identify the source of the problems. While troubleshooting the system, Caleb made a discovery that made his hands shake. The infrared sensors were detecting heat signatures in every room, but the thermal imaging showed shapes that didn't match human body heat patterns. Instead of the typical human heat signature, a vertical oval with arms and legs, the sensors were picking up amorphous, shifting masses of heat that moved like liquid mercury throughout the house. Caleb checked his equipment multiple times, thinking there was a calibration error, but the readings were consistent. The Ashford family was generating heat signatures that looked nothing like human beings. Caleb decided to test something that would either confirm his suspicions or prove he was overthinking the situation. He told Richard that he needed to calibrate the facial recognition cameras and asked the family to stand in front of each camera for system testing. The results were impossible to explain. The facial recognition software, which was designed to identify and catalog human faces, couldn't process any member of the Ashford family. The system kept displaying error messages. No human facial features detected and unable to establish biometric baseline. Caleb had tested this same software on hundreds of families without any problems. The technology was specifically designed to recognize human faces, and it had never failed to identify a person before. Richard became agitated when Caleb explained the facial recognition issues. "Perhaps your equipment is defective. We don't really need that feature anyway." But Caleb noticed something else during the testing process. When he viewed the Ashford family through the infrared camera display, their reflections appeared distorted and constantly shifting, like their physical forms were unstable. Caleb made an excuse about needing additional parts and left the house to research his findings. That evening, Caleb reviewed all the security footage he had captured during his 3 installation days. What he discovered made him realize he had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than a technical malfunction. In several clips, when the family thought they were alone, Caleb could see their physical forms briefly flickering and changing. Richard would momentarily appear taller or shorter. Victoria's hair would change color for a few seconds, and Sophia's entire facial structure would shift before snapping back to normal. The family was maintaining human appearances that required constant concentration, and occasionally their true forms would leak through their disguises. Caleb also found footage of the family having conversations in languages he couldn't identify. Harsh, guttural sounds that didn't correspond to any human language he'd ever heard. But the most chilling discovery came when Caleb enhanced the audio from these conversations. Using professional sound analysis software, he isolated individual words and ran them through translation databases. The language was Latin, but it was inverted Latin. The family was speaking traditional demonic incantations used in summoning rituals. Caleb realized the Ashford family weren't human beings at all. They were demonic entities who had taken human form to infiltrate the neighborhood, and they were using their perfect family facade to blend into the community while conducting supernatural activities. Caleb never returned to service the Ashford security system. Instead, he moved his business to a different county and began researching reports of similar perfect families who displayed unusual behavior patterns. What Caleb discovered was a network of shapeshifter demons who posed as ideal suburban families, moving from neighborhood to neighborhood every few years to avoid detection while harvesting spiritual energy from unsuspecting communities. Caleb started a private consulting service to help homeowners identify supernatural infiltrators in residential areas. He's found 17 more shapeshifter families operating throughout the region, all maintaining the same perfect family personas while conducting demonic activities behind closed doors. But Caleb told me the most disturbing part isn't that these demons exist. It's how easily they blend into suburban communities by simply appearing to be everything neighbors want in a perfect family. Because sometimes the neighbors who seem too good to be true actually are, and their perfection is just a disguise for something that feeds on the trust and comfort of the communities they infiltrate. This is about Marcus Kennedy, a 29-year-old night shift paramedic who bought his first house in a quiet suburb of Phoenix, thinking he'd found the perfect place to sleep during the day after his long hospital shifts. Marcus worked 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. at Phoenix General Hospital, so he was used to being awake during unusual hours. When he got home at 8 a.m., he would usually sleep until 4 p.m., then have a few hours to himself before heading back to work. The house next door belonged to the Crane family, Leonard, his wife Margaret, and their adult son Derek, who appeared to be in his 30s. They seemed like ordinary people when Marcus first moved in. Leonard worked in insurance. Margaret was a retired teacher, and Derek helped with his father's business. Marcus's first indication that something was wrong came during his third week in the house. At exactly 3 a.m. on a Tuesday night, while Marcus was getting ready for work, he heard what sounded like animals screaming in the Crane backyard. The sounds were horrible, high-pitched squealing and crying that went on for about 20 minutes before stopping abruptly. Marcus assumed maybe a coyote had gotten into their yard and attacked a pet, which wasn't uncommon in suburban Phoenix, but the next Tuesday at exactly 3 a.m., Marcus heard the same animal screaming sounds from the Crane property. Marcus looked out his bedroom window, which had a partial view of the Crane backyard, and saw something that made him grab his binoculars for a closer look. The Cranes had set up what appeared to be some kind of altar in their backyard. A stone table surrounded by black candles arranged in a geometric pattern. Leonard, Margaret, and Derek were standing around the altar wearing dark robes, and there was definitely an animal on the table. Marcus watched in horror as Leonard raised what looked like a knife above the animal. The screaming intensified, then stopped suddenly as Leonard brought the knife down. Marcus was sickened but tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe the Cranes practiced some kind of religious ceremony that involved animal sacrifice. Many cultures had ritualistic practices that might seem disturbing to outsiders. But the weekly pattern continued. Every Tuesday at 3 a.m., Marcus would hear the animal screams and see the Crane family conducting their ritual in the backyard. Marcus began documenting the activities, taking photos with a telephoto lens and timing the duration of each ceremony. The rituals always lasted exactly 23 minutes, always involved the sacrifice of what appeared to be small animals, and always ended with the family chanting in a language Marcus couldn't identify. After 6 weeks of weekly animal sacrifices, Marcus decided he needed to report this to authorities. Animal cruelty was illegal, and whatever the Cranes were doing was clearly causing suffering to living creatures. Marcus called Phoenix Animal Control and reported suspected animal abuse at the Crane residence. Officer Jennifer Martinez arrived the next day to investigate the complaint. Officer Martinez spoke with Leonard Crane, who denied any involvement with animals or religious ceremonies. Leonard invited her to inspect their backyard, which she found completely normal. No altar, no candles, no signs of animal sacrifice. Officer Martinez found Marcus's report suspicious and questioned him about his motivations for making false accusations against his neighbors. But Marcus knew what he had seen. He showed Officer Martinez the photographs he had taken, but when they reviewed the images together, the photos showed only an empty backyard with normal landscaping. Marcus was confused and frustrated. He was certain he had captured clear images of the altar and the sacrifice ceremonies, but the photos showed nothing unusual. Officer Martinez warned Marcus about making false reports and advised him to stop surveilling his neighbors. The following Tuesday, Marcus decided to record video evidence of the Crane family's activities. At 2:50 a.m., he positioned himself at his window with a video camera and waited for the ceremony to begin. At exactly 3 a.m., Marcus heard the familiar animal screaming and saw the Cranes conducting their ritual. He recorded the entire 23-minute ceremony, capturing clear footage of the altar, the robes, and what appeared to be animal sacrifice. But when Marcus reviewed the video footage, he was shocked to discover that it showed only an empty backyard. The camera had recorded 23 minutes of nothing, no people, no altar, no activity. Marcus was beginning to question his own sanity, but he was certain he was witnessing real events. The next week, Marcus tried a different approach. Instead of watching from his house, he decided to get closer to the Crane property during their Tuesday night ritual. At 2:55 a.m., Marcus crept into his backyard and positioned himself near the fence separating his property from the Cranes. From this closer vantage point, he could clearly see and hear everything happening in their yard. What Marcus witnessed made him realize the true horror of the situation. The Cranes were conducting their ritual as usual, but as Marcus watched more carefully, he realized the animal on their altar wasn't an animal at all. It was a small human figure, what appeared to be a child or infant. Marcus watched in absolute terror as the Crane family performed what was clearly human sacrifice, not animal sacrifice. The screaming he had been hearing for months was coming from human victims. Marcus immediately called 911 and reported a murder in progress at the Crane residence. Police responded within minutes, but when they arrived, they found the Crane backyard empty and normal. Detective Paul Thompson interviewed Marcus about his emergency call, but found no evidence of any criminal activity. The Cranes were asleep in their house, and there were no signs of altars, rituals, or victims. Detective Thompson ordered a thorough search of the Crane property, including ground-penetrating radar to check for buried remains. The search revealed nothing suspicious. Marcus was evaluated by a police psychiatrist, Dr. Sarah Chen, who determined that Marcus was experiencing stress-induced hallucinations, possibly related to the traumatic nature of his paramedic work. But Marcus knew he wasn't hallucinating. He was witnessing real human sacrifices that somehow couldn't be detected by cameras, other witnesses, or physical evidence. Marcus quit his job and moved out of the house within 2 weeks. He couldn't continue living next to people who were murdering children, even if no one else could see what was happening. Before leaving, Marcus researched the history of his neighborhood and discovered something that explained everything. Between 1987 and 2019, 17 children had disappeared from the Phoenix area under mysterious circumstances. All of the disappearances occurred on Tuesday nights, and none of the missing children were ever found. The disappearances stopped in 2019, when the previous owner of Marcus's house moved away. Marcus realized that his house's location provided the only vantage point from which the Crane family's activities could be observed. The sacrifices were happening on a supernatural level that could only be witnessed from specific coordinates. Marcus contacted the families of the missing children and shared his findings with private investigators, but without physical evidence, no action could be taken against the Crane family. Marcus now lives in a different state, but he told me that sometimes he wakes up at exactly 3 a.m. on Tuesday nights, hearing the screaming of children and knowing that somewhere the midnight sacrifices are continuing with no one able to stop them. Because some neighbors' evil activities exist in a reality that only certain people can perceive, making them impossible to prove or prevent through normal means. This is about Oliver Hayes, a 33-year-old construction foreman who moved to Willowbrook Street after his divorce, looking for a quiet neighborhood where he could rebuild his life in peace. Oliver's house at 1642. Willowbrook was perfect for his needs, affordable, well-maintained, and surrounded by elderly neighbors who kept to themselves. The house directly across the street belonged to Iris Whitmore, a 67-year-old widow who had lived there for over 30 years. Oliver first noticed Iris during his second week on the street. She was a small, frail woman who rarely left her house and seemed to spend most of her time sitting on her front porch, watching the neighborhood with intense focus. What struck Oliver as unusual was Iris's behavior during his third week. At exactly 2:47 a.m. on a Wednesday night, Oliver was woken by the most horrifying sound he'd ever heard. A woman screaming with such anguish and terror that it made his blood freeze. The screaming came from Iris's house and lasted for exactly 11 minutes before stopping abruptly. Oliver looked out his window and saw lights on in Iris's house, but no signs of distress or emergency. He considered calling police, but the screaming had stopped and everything appeared normal. The next morning, Oliver checked on Iris by knocking on her door. She answered looking perfectly fine, calm, polite, and showing no signs of having been in distress. "I heard some concerning sounds from your house last night," Oliver said. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." Iris looked confused. "I'm sorry, but I don't know what you mean." "I slept peacefully all night." Oliver was certain about what he'd heard, but Iris seemed genuinely unaware of any screaming. 2 days later, Oliver learned something that made him reconsider the incident. Walter Chen, an elderly man who lived 4 houses down from Iris, had died suddenly of a heart attack on Wednesday night, the same night Oliver heard Iris screaming. Oliver thought this was a coincidence until 3 weeks later, when Iris's screaming happened again. At 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, Oliver was again woken by the same horrific screaming coming from Iris's house. This time he timed it. Exactly 11 minutes of the most anguished wailing he'd ever heard. The next morning, Oliver discovered that Nancy Rodriguez, who lived 2 blocks away, had died in her sleep during the night. Nancy had been healthy and active, making her sudden death unexpected and shocking to the community. Oliver began to see a disturbing pattern. Iris's nighttime screaming seemed to coincide with deaths in the neighborhood. Oliver started keeping a journal, documenting every instance of Iris's screaming and checking local obituaries for corresponding deaths. Over the next 2 months, the pattern was undeniable. Every time Iris screamed at 2:47 a.m. for exactly 11 minutes, someone in the Willowbrook area died within hours of the incident. The deaths were always unexpected. Heart attacks, strokes, accidents, or medical emergencies that took people suddenly without warning. Oliver researched Iris's history and discovered something that made the pattern even more disturbing. Iris had lived on Willowbrook Street since 1991, and according to neighborhood records, residents had been reporting her nighttime episodes for over 3 decades. But Oliver also found something else in the historical records. The mortality rate in the Willowbrook area was significantly higher than surrounding neighborhoods, with an unusually high number of sudden, unexpected deaths. Oliver decided to test his theory by tracking Iris's behavior more systematically. He set up a recording device pointed at her house and began monitoring her activities around the clock. Oliver discovered that Iris's screaming episodes followed a specific pattern. She would spend the entire day before each episode sitting on her porch, staring intently at a particular house or direction. That night she would scream at 2:47 a.m., and within 24 hours, someone would die. Oliver realized that Iris wasn't just randomly screaming. She was somehow sensing or predicting specific deaths and announcing them through her anguished cries. Oliver tried confronting Iris about the pattern he'd discovered, but she continued to deny any knowledge of screaming or having nighttime episodes. "Mr. Hayes, I think you might be experiencing stress-related hallucinations," Iris suggested. "Perhaps you should speak with a doctor about these concerns." But Oliver knew he wasn't imagining the screaming. Other neighbors had mentioned Iris's episodes in casual conversations, though most attributed them to grief, loneliness, or age-related dementia. Oliver's investigation took a dark turn when he discovered the true extent of Iris's predictions. By cross-referencing death records with reports of Iris's screaming episodes, Oliver found that she had accurately predicted 127 deaths over 32 years. The deaths weren't random, they all involved people who lived within a specific radius of Iris's house, suggesting that her supernatural ability was geographically limited to her immediate area. Oliver also discovered that Iris had moved to Willowbrook Street shortly after her husband died in a car accident in 1991. According to old newspaper reports, Iris had been in the car during the crash and had survived, but witnesses reported that she had started screaming 11 minutes before the collision occurred. Oliver realized that Iris's traumatic experience had somehow given her the ability to sense approaching deaths, and her screaming was an involuntary response to the supernatural knowledge she couldn't control. But Oliver's most disturbing discovery came when he found medical records indicating that Iris had been born with a rare neurological condition that caused her to experience severe episodes of prophetic awareness during times of approaching tragedy. Iris wasn't a supernatural banshee. She was a woman with a documented medical condition that allowed her to unconsciously detect biological and environmental signs that preceded sudden deaths. Her screaming episodes occurred when her heightened senses detected subtle changes in electromagnetic fields, air pressure, and other environmental factors that indicated someone nearby was about to experience fatal medical distress. Oliver learned that Iris's condition was triggered by her traumatic accident, which had amplified her natural sensitivity to pre-death biological markers that most people couldn't perceive. Oliver approached Iris with his findings and offered to help her understand and manage her condition. Iris admitted that she had been aware of her predictive episodes, but was terrified that people would think she was causing the deaths rather than simply sensing them. "I've lived with this curse for 30 years, Iris confided. "Every time I scream, I know someone is going to die, but I can't stop it from happening. I can only announce what's already been determined." Oliver helped Iris connect with medical researchers who specialized in rare neurological conditions. Through proper treatment and medication, Iris's episodes became less frequent and less intense. Oliver learned that sometimes the most supernatural-seeming neighborhood mysteries have scientific explanations. And the scary neighbor isn't actually dangerous. They're just dealing with a condition that makes them appear threatening when they're actually suffering. Iris's screaming episodes stopped completely after 6 months of treatment, and the neighborhood's mortality rate returned to normal levels. Because some people are cursed not with supernatural powers, but with the medical burden of knowing when tragedy is approaching without being able to prevent it. This is about Zoe Lambert, a 28-year-old freelance journalist who rented a small house on Cedar Grove Lane, thinking she'd found the perfect quiet neighborhood to focus on her writing career. Zoe's house at 847 Cedar Grove sat directly next to 849, where the Patterson family lived. James, his wife Linda, and their twin daughters Emma and Grace, both around 10 years old. They seemed like the ideal suburban family when Zoe first moved in. The Pattersons were friendly but kept to themselves, James worked what appeared to be regular office hours, leaving every morning at 8 a.m. and returning at 6 p.m. Linda maintained a beautiful garden and could often be seen doing household chores throughout the day. The twins played in their backyard and rode bicycles on the quiet street. Zoe's first indication that something was unusual came during her second month on Cedar Grove Lane. She noticed that the Patterson family never seemed to age or change their routines in any way. James wore the exact same gray suit and blue tie every single day for 8 weeks. Linda always wore the same floral dress and had identical hairstyle. The twins wore matching pink outfits that never appeared dirty or worn despite their active play. Zoe thought maybe the family just preferred consistent routines and clothing choices, but after 3 months of identical daily patterns, she began paying closer attention to their activities. The Pattersons' behavior was mechanically precise. James left for work at exactly 8:17 a.m. every morning, walking to his car with identical movements and gestures. Linda watered her garden at 10:30 a.m. and 4:45 p.m. with mathematical precision. The twins played outside from 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. with no variation in their games or interactions. Zoe realized the family never deviated from their schedule by even a minute, never had visitors, and never received mail or packages. Zoe decided to investigate more closely. She positioned herself at her kitchen window during the Patterson family's dinner time and observed their evening routine through their dining room window. What she saw made her stomach turn. The Patterson family sat at their dining table with elaborate meals, but none of them actually ate anything. They would cut food, move it around their plates, and have animated conversations, but no food ever reached their mouths. After exactly 45 minutes, the family would clear their still full plates and proceed to their evening activities with the same mechanical precision as their daytime routines. Zoe watched this dinner charade for 2 weeks and never saw any family member consume food or drink anything. Zoe tried to interact with the Pattersons more directly. She knocked on their door at various times, hoping to have normal neighborly conversations and observe their behavior up close. But the Pattersons never answered their door, despite Zoe being able to see them inside the house through windows. They would continue their activities as if they couldn't hear knocking or doorbell ringing. Zoe called out to Linda while she was gardening, but Linda didn't respond or acknowledge Zoe's presence, even when Zoe stood directly next to the property line calling her name. It was as if the Patterson family existed in a bubble where they could see and be seen but couldn't interact with the outside world. Zoe's investigation took a disturbing turn when she researched the history of 849 Cedar Grove Lane. What she discovered in public records made her question everything she thought she knew about her neighbors. According to county death certificates, James Patterson had died of a heart attack on March 15, 2019. Linda Patterson had died in a car accident on March 17, 2019. Emma and Grace Patterson had died in the same car accident as their mother. The entire Patterson family had been dead for 4 years. But Zoe could see them every day, following their routines, maintaining their house, and living what appeared to be normal suburban lives. Zoe contacted the county clerk's office to verify the death records. The certificates were legitimate and detailed. The Patterson family had definitely died in March 2019, yet they were somehow continuing their daily activities in 2023. Zoe researched further and found newspaper articles about the Patterson family's deaths. James had suffered a fatal heart attack at his office on a Tuesday morning. Linda and the twins had died 2 days later when their car was struck by a drunk driver while driving to James's funeral. The articles included photographs of the Patterson family, and they were definitely the same people Zoe was seeing every day. Zoe discovered something even more disturbing in property records. The house at 849 Cedar Grove Lane had been vacant and unsold since March 2019. According to the real estate listings, no one had lived there for 4 years. Yet Zoe could see the family maintaining the property, keeping the lawn mowed, and going about their daily routines as if they were still alive. Zoe decided to test whether other people could see the Patterson family. She invited her sister Maya to visit and observe the neighbors without explaining what Zoe had discovered. Maya spent an afternoon watching the house at 849 Cedar Grove Lane and reported that it appeared completely empty and abandoned. Maya couldn't see any family members' activities or signs of habitation. Zoe realized she was the only person who could see the undead Patterson family continuing their posthumous existence. Zoe researched why she might have this unique ability and discovered something in her own medical history that explained everything. Zoe had suffered a near-death experience during a childhood surgery, and some people who survive clinical death retain the ability to perceive spirits and otherworldly phenomena. Zoe understood that the Patterson family had died so suddenly and traumatically that their spirits were trapped in a loop, endlessly repeating their final week of life, unaware that they had passed away. The family was stuck in March 2019, reliving their last normal routines before tragedy struck, unable to move on to whatever comes after death. Zoe tried communicating with the Patterson family through various methods, leaving notes, shouting messages, and even trying to physically enter their property. But nothing broke through their spiritual barrier. The family remained locked in their eternal routine, visible only to someone who had briefly crossed the boundary between life and death. Zoe eventually moved away from Cedar Grove Lane, but she told me that she still thinks about the Patterson family trapped forever in their final week of happiness, unaware that their suburban dream had become their eternal prison. Because sometimes when families die suddenly, their love for their normal life is so strong that death can't make them let go of their daily routines, even when those routines become meaningless repetitions in a world they no longer truly inhabit.